And now we're rolling into our final work-related session, the panel discussion on cybersecurity. What I'd like to do is go around and have everyone introduce themselves. So let's start with Shan. Can you go ahead and kick off and give everyone a quick introduction about yourself?
All right. Thank you. My name is Shan. I work for State Street as a cyber and infosec risk director. So I have several years of experience on everything cyber, basically from my days in IBM to various professional services firms, and I look forward to meeting you all.
Okay, great. Thank you, Shan. Checco, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, John Checco. I work for Proofpoint. I'm the resident CISO for financial services, formerly with Bank of America. So I've been involved with the WSTA since 1997, and glad to be here.
Okay, great. Tom, I think it is over to you.
Thanks, Johna. Tom Doughty, Chief Information Security Officer at Prudential for going on 16 years now. So while the landscape is quite different, been involved with WSTA for several years now, and I appreciate you spending a little bit of time with us today.
Okay, great. And now we have a last-minute change due to unavoidable circumstances. Victor Danevich, CTO System Engineering at Infoblox. Would you like to introduce yourself, Victor?
Hey, thank you, Johna. So my name is Victor Danevich. I've been with Infoblox for about 17 years. My role is doing DNS and DHCP. My roots kind of started at Harvard University and went into consulting and doing a whole bunch of different things. And my role today here at Infoblox is kind of bridging that gap between customer environments and changing and emerging into security, which has gone from nothing as part of DNS to a very critical part of the infrastructure going forward. So I've enjoyed, like the other panelists here, that ride, that journey as things continue to evolve.
Great. Thank you, Victor, and thanks for stepping in on short notice. Very much appreciated. Last but far from least, Bruce Potter, Chief Information Security Officer from Expel. Bruce?
Howdy. Bruce Potter, CISO at Expel. I've been with the company about 3 years. Prior to that, did a lot of cybersecurity research and engineering in the federal government, IC, DoD space. And in my spare time, my wife and I run ShmooCon, the HackerCon down in DC each year.
Okay, great. Well, we have a fabulous team pulled together, and we have a lot of discussions that are very, very pertinent based on the presentations that you've seen. So I'm going to start with zero trust. I kicked off this morning by talking about the importance of zero trust. You heard many of the panelists, many of the presentations refer back to zero trust. How real is it? We've all been talking about it as analysts and thought leaders, but how real is it in the real world? How many folks are actually moving to it? What are the pros and cons? Bruce, maybe you can kick us off with that and give us your thoughts, and we'll run around the panel session.
I think that zero trust is, it means different things to different people, right? There's different ways to slice this up. I think if you think about every endpoint, every system having to be fully defensible on its own as just a broad concept, the system has to maintain its integrity, has to look out for itself. I think it's been, it's a powerful concept. And certainly in the last 4 months, we've seen more organizations shifting to it as a reality because you didn't necessarily trust your employees' home network before, but suddenly, that's where they live. And so for at least your endpoints, you had to have an awful lot of controls in place to have them live next to their kid's laptop that's doing schoolwork and their media server and whatever other odds and ends are going on. So, even if organizations weren't doing, quote, zero trust in February of 2020, by almost de facto, a lot of them are doing it right now today in July, just the nature of where their workforce is. And what that really means is that we've rapidly had to deploy new controls onto these endpoints to try to put up with that new trust environment.
So basically your take is that that COVID-19 has driven the adoption of zero trust.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that CISO after CISO that I've talked to has, even if they don't use the word, what they're describing that they had to do over a several week period in March ultimately was a zero trust model.
Everyone else? Thoughts?
Hey, so go ahead, Sean.
No, I was about to agree to that, but I think it's like, still coming back to the basics, right? It's very similar to how do you, like, really minimize your attack surface, and how do you protect it? Like, going back to, like, having a properly segmented network, and, like, enough trust between, like, various endpoints and so on. So,
And for us here at
go ahead.
Infoblox, we're embracing that zero trust model and this concept where you trust nothing. There's got to be a better way to authenticate to ensure and protect the integrity of every connection between every device or application prior to something happening. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, I think, as we go with the panel here.
Yeah, and I agree with Bruce is that the concept of zero trust means different things to different people. But I think the biggest challenge I see is dealing with legacy environments or existing infrastructure, and how to put a zero trust principles over on top, layered on top of your existing security controls, and that's going to be the biggest challenge, I think.
Well, and
I
before we
would just
talk
add
about
that makes sense.
challenges, oh, go ahead.
Sorry. What that brings up, what John was just saying on top of Bruce's comments, is that people sometimes think zero trust is really only about the endpoint, and it's really not, even if just in the IAM space. That connective tissue at what's now a new view of the infrastructure level to facilitate that is really the harder part of the more profound investment that you have to make.
And Bruce kind of stressed that people are moving farther towards zero trust in the wake of COVID-19. That raises an obvious question. How can you tell how far you are along on the pathway, on the journey to zero trust? How can an organization measure their progress?
So, John Checco here again, and I would posture to say that with COVID-19, more people are moving a lot of their workloads to the cloud, and that gives you the opportunity to create zero trust controls on top of that. So, how far are you? I think that's a real tough question, because we can't even measure cybersecurity correctly these days. So.
I
There
think
are some
that you
macro
can
level
probably look.
indicators, though, or lack thereof. I mean, as an example, in this environment, if you're doing a lot of remote work, but you're still doing a lot of backhauling to your corporate environment to do things like IAM framework, and you're still using, as we are, and many are, client-based VPN software, you're still putting workloads into the cloud. You're still working remotely, but you're not in a zero trust environment. You're laying on top some legacy choke points that really are not architecturally where you want to be when you're putting workloads in the cloud like that.
Yeah, I think if you look in your data center and you look at your VPN load, you'll know how zero trust you are, right? Like, I think I've seen organizations over the last few months, the VPN load is going down because they're going to more cloud-based systems. But Tom, to your point, there's still plenty of things happening inside their walls. And then, if you think of, do I have kind of east-west visibility on those workloads? Do I understand what's happening? Can I kind of deperimeterize what's occurring internally? A lot of organizations aren't thinking zero trust in that sense. I think that rather than try to zero trust inside their wall, it's almost synonymous at times with going cloud native. And so that's why I think that the VPN traffic is kind of a surrogate for how zero trusty are you.
Yeah, I'd agree that the surrogate is absolutely a part of it. Also, from a DNS or DHCP standpoint, we see, this architecture where I have a centralized service. I may have 700 or 800 remote retail locations, but this concept of backhauling everything to the corporate office, right? And there's only one checkpoint or one, stop or one authentication. There's nothing distributed in that case. And the work from home, and especially the COVID-19, has kind of caused companies even like us to rethink where that edge is. And where do those decisions need to be made? So I agree. Also, it's very difficult to put a number or some type of metric, but there's many surrogates that kind of give you an idea. How current are we? Are we caught up, or are we far behind, or what areas do we need to improve in? And it's an emerging technology that continues to grow and change almost daily.
Okay, it looks like everyone has had a chance to weigh in. What I'd like to do is do a quick round robin of the group, and I'll call out your names so we don't have to worry about stepping on each other's toes. But give me the year at which you think most financial services firms will be most of the way, air quotes here, towards zero trust, whether your definition of most of the way is 80% there, 90% there, 99% there. Just give me the year when you think we're going to be that close. And Tom, I'll start with you.
Always a hazard to go first and be adjusted off, but I would say 2023, and I would probably hedge that toward the back end of 2023. So close to 3 years from now would be my guess.
Okay, so Tom says 3 years from now. Checco, what about you?
So, Tom was just in that magic trick where he was off by 2. I was going to say 2025.
Okay, 2025. Great. Bruce, what about you?
I was thinking the same thing, 2025. I think that a lot of organizations got a big jump start, whether or not they wanted it, in the last 6 months, but it's going to take a while to shake out the dusty corners to get to mostly zero trust.
Shan, what about you?
I think I will go with the 3 to 5 year roadmap, like anywhere from 23 to 25, as a lot of things are in flex.
Okay. And Victor, what about you?
2023. I think 2025, a little further out, just from our understanding, you need to think about the cycles and when people do refreshes and when products do. And, I can't imagine, 5 years from now, somebody still paying to do a complete refresh on a on-premise type of technology. And I think they're going to use the opportunity, as we've seen the data center go smaller and smaller over time, to leverage that opportunity to be able to shift and update and introduce different types of technologies going on. Even some of our more hardcore, and I'm talking hardcore, never let a packet leak, are starting to open up. It doesn't mean they're going to implement it this year or next year, but they understand the cost factor, the benefits, and the need to modernize their networks. And I think that adoption is going to come a little bit quicker than 2025, and I think it's more towards the 2023, probably mid to late, as Tom had noted as well. I'd agree with him on that.
And James? James, what year do you think most companies will be most of the way towards zero trust? Oh, okay. In that case, let's see. We got Shan, we got Checco, we got Tom, we got Bruce, and we got Victor, so we are good. Okay, so folks, we have a roughly 18-month time period. So if you are not on track to be at zero trust between 2023 and 2025, we are, you may want to think about adjusting your strategy. Victor, I have a question that's kind of a softball for you, but I think it's really important, which is this. Let's talk about the role of internet infrastructure, DNS, DHCP, in serving as both as points of vulnerability and points of protection.
Yeah, most definitely. So I don't know if it's good to bad. It kind of dates me, but I've been doing DNS and DHCP for almost 25 plus years. Kind of dates me a little bit in this case. Working literally when we were setting up Harvard.edu was one of the first internet domains going from DECnet. And it's always been this back closet piece of technology up until probably about 5 or even 6 years ago. DNS was, everybody thought, hey, just ask it a question, give me an answer, but that has changed immensely. The hackers are starting to understand and, really appreciate and build command and control. And we're dealing with some of the advanced topics. And in 2 parts to your question, if I heard you correctly, the first one was about vulnerability. There's several things that happen that are very, very public nowadays. When DNS goes bad, it goes bad, like what happened to Danevich a couple of years and a half ago, and that was a DDoS type of attack. And what we've done is try to get a little bit smarter about that type of technology to be able to, separate the good packets from the bad packet. And that thinking, right, even 5 years ago was not there from any manufacturer, whether it's Microsoft or any other vendor. The second one, we're dealing in a deep concern from a security standpoint is data exfiltration, because port 53 for DNS is generally speaking wide open and you have no idea what's going on. And I was working with a customer up in Minneapolis, a major manufacturer for the U.S. government. And the guy says, we had a few megabytes of traffic and all of a sudden we're doing a gig almost a day of DNS traffic. And he says, we don't understand what's going on. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to really understand, right, that you're passing more than just DNS traffic. You got data exfiltration, which is about getting data outside your company through your firewall's detection. And over, I mean, even the best of technology sometimes can't pick up every single type thing. So it's about the detection piece. What we're concerned about now is data infiltration, and that's where just simple DNS queries can literally build a command and control server inside your DNS. So if I could do an outbound query, I can find a PC within your network to do a DDNS update. I can insert text records. Most command and control records are text records inside of DNS, and I can literally start to build that. So we need even better, more leading or cutting edge pieces of technology that can do that detection and mitigation. Part two, I think, if I heard you correctly, is about the protection piece and can I do things, right? And this is where it starts to get cutting edge, because dealing with billions of queries a second per day, or dealing with data exfiltration, doesn't happen in these nice little neat packets. We've seen command and control do 100 packets today, 50 packets tomorrow, and you have to put all this data together to make a kind of thing. This is where the machine learning and the AI, or the artificial intelligence, starts to come into play. And you need to be able to recognize these patterns over a long period of time. And the technology that's on premise, right, a Wintel type box, even if you've got the biggest of the biggest machines, isn't capable of processing that much data over a long period of time. And this is where the cloud comes in. Right, so this, the promise of the cloud being the unlimited CPU, RAM, and disk. You need more, just spin it up and you go. But that is being used for the computational piece for machine learning and this artificial intelligence. So gather what I can, apply it back, and that gives you the protection, or a better way to look at it. Just simply leaving a system unchecked anymore, it's not good enough anymore. You're being taken advantage, and you don't even know what's happening. And again, kind of when I started. This dialogue here 5 years ago, I never thought about any of this stuff. It was about performance and how fast could you do DNS and DHCP. Now it's become a major hole in the dike. That companies are working quickly to harvest the data, to plug the hole, and to be able to take better advantage of it.
Victor, that is eye-opening. I thought I knew the DNS risks, and I was thinking entirely exfiltration. I never thought about infiltration, and I certainly didn't think about the value of the cloud and being able to track and compare data profiles with, today compared to, say, a year ago, because you have all that information and you can quickly run your AI and say, hang on, I've seen that before.
Right, or the behavioral piece that comes with the machine learning, right? So, a simple Nest thermostat, using as only an example here, but for 3 years we communicated with a server in California or someplace, and all of a sudden, the behavior starts to change. We need better ways to detect at the earliest. And keep in mind, I think there was a SANS article several years ago, and it was the only one that I've seen in this particular area, but they looked at the first 60 seconds of malware. And the lesson learned out of that, right? They didn't care what the malware did, but the very first packet on the wire was a DNS query, and it was looking for a command and control, packet. So, it leads into this concept of, we know about blacklists and we know how to apply them and do all those things, but the why was never really there. And the idea here that if I can catch it or prevent it or stop it at the very first packet, right, that's the detection piece, I can offer better protection. But now I need to learn from that. I blocked this one, I blocked that one. There is a pattern here. How do we apply it? And then how do we start to share that information with other systems?
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Switching gears slightly, we heard from a lot of our presenters today about the importance of making decisions based not on technology, but on risk. And so risk, really a category that I call risk-based cybersecurity investment and planning. And particularly Tom and Shan. And Shan, I'll probably start with you just so we can avoid stepping on each other's toes. There's an increasing demand among board members and senior leadership to understand the risk impact of cybersecurity decisions, whether it's investments or staffing, organizational, operational changes. So in other words, hey boss, I need a new person, I need 3 new people, I need to buy a new product, I need to get a new service. What are some of your best practices for quantifying the impact of cybersecurity activities on risk and communicating that to the board? Shan?
All right, that's a loaded question, but I think like with any of the other things, right? If there is something that you cannot measure, then you cannot even manage, right? So how do we really quantify, like, what is your risk? And the best way to do would be really to do a domain assessment, right? If you do a maturity assessment based on, like, what you have or what you don't have, and you compare with your peers, and then you really, like, see, like, whether you are matching all of the best practices, or whether you have any of the known frameworks, and so on, right? This is over and beyond, like, taking care of the regular house cleaning stuff, doing your, like, normal patching and normal, like, vulnerability scans, all of that. They all, like, just pay the bill. But, like, what are we looking for, like anything additional, right? If you have a, like, maturity model, and then, like, you classify, and then you say, I am currently in, like, stage 2, and I want to move to stage 3, for example, right? Then you base your, like, work plans and your roadmap on that, and then you seek investments, or you seek, like, support for your initiatives. This is, again, it's not going to be a, like, security driven, like, initiative, right? It is going to be, like, supported fully by the business, maybe the compliance, maybe the regulations, a lot of things that need to happen. And, like, there is, like, quite a good amount of, like, education that needs to happen there.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Tom?
I think Sean's answer was really well aligned, because when you start talking, particularly at the board level, I'm not talking about individual FTEs or individual tools for the most part, but really understanding your not only your maturity against a given framework that's externally benchmarkable, whether it be the NIST domains, that's usually a good vehicle, matching that against your strategy, matching it against what business outcomes and business of IT, meaning security outcomes, are you planning to accomplish in whatever time frame you want to talk with them about, the next 3 years, for instance, and aligning that and understanding, is there a solid rationale for where I'm going to invest over the next few years that matches either toward a relative area of improvement in maturity or an aspiration in maturity. And on top of that, it warrants a little bit of understanding that different capabilities inherently might require more investment than others. So even categorically, if you look at, if you have a relatively high maturity in protection and detection, even maintaining that, because those tend to be technology and infrastructure heavy capabilities, that might cost more to even maintain your maturity in those levels than even, say, an incremental improvement in the identify domain, which is actually more about governance and things of that nature. So really, I agree in substance with what Shan said, but it's being able to articulate to the board, what are your objectives and capabilities from a delivery perspective over the next 3 years, and how does that investment to get there, where are you planning on spending, how does that match to your maturity?
I agree with both those points, and I'll weigh in and then open it up to the rest of the panel. One thing that I do a lot with clients is build a customized risk dashboard. So we look at we quantify the major risks to the organization: reputational risk, loss of intellectual property, fines, and regulatory noncompliance. And then we look at every security activity through the lens of, does it reduce the likelihood of me getting hit with this? So whatever your current risk is of any of those things, to what extent does the security action I'm about to take reduce that risk, raise that risk, or stay the same? And that becomes a very useful way to look at things. Of course, drawing that connection is sometimes the challenging part, but at least if you start with demonstrating a knowledge of what the business risks are, you're kind of ahead of the curve. Anyone else want to weigh in quickly before we leave the topic of risk?
Yeah, I think, John Checco here again, and I think one of the factors that we have to take into consideration is lead time. If you're looking at changing a framework or bolstering your security posture or taking some major steps for security maturity, it takes time to look at the market, to see what's out there. And Victor had said it before, right? You have to understand when your licenses are expiring. You can't just wait until you have 6 months left on a license to say, hey, this is where we want to go. So you kind of need some foresight and some planning. And sometimes there's a gamble there, right, on where you think the trends are going to be.
Great. Thanks,
Yeah,
Checco.
and
Yep.
I was just going to say, I think, I agree with Tom that having a risk framework, whatever one you've chosen, to discuss strategy is super important, because if you look at risk frameworks versus control frameworks, you're gonna find your maturity isn't uniform all the way around. You're gonna have places where you're deficient, or places where you have lower maturity and higher maturity. And if that's an overt choice that you can articulate to board and other oversight entities, great. If it's something that's happening and you're trying to close that gap, you still need to be able to articulate, hey, we're deficient here and we're trying to close it, versus there are places, if you look at the CSF as an example, where you may choose to have lower levels of maturity than others, given the industry that you're in, given the threats that your organization faces. So having that as the backstop to have a strategy discussion of where that horse trading is occurring, I found to be super useful, and cuts off at the path boards who want to come dive down to, why is this score so low? And you'd be like, because we meant it to be. And that's much more powerful than getting bludgeoned about the head because you had a low score.
Yeah, and that just raises the great point that I've heard before, that the role of cybersecurity is not to eliminate risk. It's simply to align the cybersecurity risk with the business appetite for risk. I want to move forward and remind the audience that you are more than welcome to submit questions. I have to approve them before they appear, but submit them early and often so that I can approve them. But panel, what is your impression of how financial institutions are addressing SWIFT and PCI regulatory requirements? Nobody wants to go. Look at this. Everybody's staring at the question going, me? Come on, Victor, you look like you're yearning to answer that. Any thoughts?
Yeah, the PCI piece, let's start there first. PCI for us, we don't store any type of credit card data or anything else. But for us, it's about compliance, about who made a change when, and the document, all the documentation that goes along with role-based administration, improving people who have access to what, and being able to provide that data to other systems further downstream, like a SIM tool or any other automation step that goes in that case. We're gaining visibility, right, for core infrastructures. And I'm speaking largely DNS and DHCP log data in the PCI compliance piece. Who had access? When did they have access? When did they go on the network? What type of device? That IPAM-ish. Tell me. IPAM in itself even has changed definition from planning of networks to IPAM now really means tell me everything there is to know about that IP on the network and pull all this data together and share it. So the PCI piece is what resonated with me on your question and why I smiled. I love the fact that we can contribute in that area to make it better.
Yeah.
Anyone
very
else?
Similar for the Swift. This is Shan. So very similar for the Swift as well, right? With Swift, with being a protocol and being used by a lot of other people, there is a lot of coordination and control that happens, and there is always your key change management initiative is what is at the forefront there, right? Complying to a protocol change or complying to any of the regulatory requirements, it is really not the difficult part, but it's really how do you do it in a fashion that you can still communicate with your other Swift partners, right? That is a very important step that we need to address.
I think Shan hit that on the head. When you're dealing in the financial industry where so many institutions are working together to settle a transaction, they all have to kind of be on the same page on how the regulatory requirements are interpreted. Otherwise, you have some open gaps there, and Swift is a great example of that.
So I guess the fair answer to that question is we're moving towards it, but we're not there yet. So thank you for asking that question. And here's a little reminder to everyone else to please submit questions. And I'll go back to some of the topics that we had discussed. We talked a bit about risk earlier, and Bruce, I know it is near and dear to your heart, the whole question of third-party risk management. Given that third-party risk management was already complex and largely unsolved before COVID, now that organizations are even more cloud forward than they were 3 months ago, how do we reform third-party risk management? Are there technology solutions that'll help us do that? How do we begin to tackle the whole problem with third-party risk management? And Bruce, go ahead and start, and then I'll open it up.
Sure. So, I think that the last few months have really pulled into focus the importance of third-party risk management in our organizations, and I've seen a wide diversity of responses to what's happened. One CISO I know, they saw this kind of rapid push to cloud and having to have more services outside their data center, and they accelerated their third-party risk program. They poured some gas in the fire, and as questions came in or as new vendor requests came in, they were turning them out as fast as they could because they recognized that's what they had to do to support what the business needed. And on the flip side, I know another CISO that when they sent everyone home, they also basically shut down their third-party risk management program and said, no new products. Like, we're going to just make do with whatever puzzle pieces we have. That's all we can handle right now. We don't want to introduce more risk than existed a couple of days ago. And then they slowly turned that dial up. And I think one thing it's called into focus for me is the difference in the way different organizations think about third-party risk, and are you viewing it through a control framework lens where you're saying, do you have these controls in place, or are you dealing with it in more of a risk-based lens where you're asking questions and you're trying to gather evidence that address the particular risk that you're worried about with respect to this third party. I get a lot of questionnaires that'll ask, do I have specific controls implemented? And I have to respond, no, but what I think you're really asking is, how am I addressing this risk? And here's the controls we have in place to address that, which is, unfortunately, it's complicated. It leads to a longer process, right? And it's just a drag on all of us right now, right? I mean, there's some organizations, 40, 50, 60% of their staff are dealing with some form of third-party risk and not, frankly, moving the ball forward. And I would hope, to get to your question, like, how do we deal with this going forward? We all hold risk differently. We all think about what we're trying to manage differently in our organizations and through our own businesses. But 90% of the information that we're trying to gather when we assess these organizations is the same. And I would hope that clearinghouses and common sources of data and common types of questionnaires would, start to put a dent in the workload. My current problem with that is, like, everyone's got their own special thing that they want to ask a bunch of questions on, and then suddenly you've got 1,000 question questionnaire with an extra 200 that are tailored to your organization, and you ask that of a SaaS provider that consists of 3 people, right? Like, they're never going to participate. They're never going to answer those questions. So, I feel like we're all basically inventing the same wheel, and I hope we can find some solutions around it. But at the very least, what I've seen in the last 4 months, the organizations who were thinking about third-party risk as a legitimate risk management function have been more successful in onboarding and managing new vendors than ones who are dealing with it from a control perspective, who've got mired down in their own process.
Yeah, I'd have to weigh in on that and say, absolutely, when we look at our success metrics, there's a strong correlation between having an effective third-party risk management and being successful. But I have to also say, every time you mention questionnaires, I get hives, because not only can questionnaires be lied on or just misinformed, you're not actually validating, but they're not dynamic. So I'm hoping that those third-party clearinghouses, that if and when they do emerge, will also be dynamic and be able to register any change in the environment of the provider that would affect their risk posture to you. Anyone else here have thoughts they want to add on third-party risk?
I want to know if Bruce will hire or fill out our RFPs. Great response. We're Infoblox with our threat intelligence feeds, and we curate our own thing. I'm on the other side of that equation. We provide, a risk number, a risk profile, right? So if a threat comes in, we can help a customer, prioritize and say, hey, this is really a threat 1 versus a threat 50. I guess one of my questions is, Bruce, how does that play into risk management when you have conflicting vendors, or do you see it as an aggregation or a help, right? Is more data better or worse? Sorry, I'm asking
I think that in general, more data is better. I guess where I fall on that is, I treat data sources a bit like the Matrix, right? Like, if you squint, you can kind of see the pattern, and then you can go from there. And so if I have different threat feeds, different sources of information, all largely agreeing, then, okay, now I know how I need to treat this problem and the way I need to think about it going forward. If everyone's got a different idea, or if I'm getting kind of, apples, oranges, and spark plugs as far as, information from my threat feeds, then I know that we're in a time of, whatever this is, there's a lot of churn, there's chaos, there's not agreement, which may mean, like, I'm going to have to make a lot more stringent risk decision because this is too chaotic, right? So I need to have more controls in place or whatever. So I think the more the better, but I don't spend a lot of time down in the weeds on these things. Again, I just kind of squint as it goes by and make the decision that way.
Thank you. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's great. Anyone else have anything to add on third-party risk before we shift gears slightly?
I would kind of add having both lenses as well, being a large institution that does due diligence of others and then having many do due diligence of us on a recurring basis, there is a bit of an inverse relationship between size and complexity and therefore resource, typically speaking, of the organization doing the due diligence versus their willingness to take a third-party assessment, whether it be the SIG questionnaire or any other framework, at face value. And in fact, it just becomes a starting point and changes the level of resolution of some of the due diligence are going to be. But the larger the institution, generally speaking, the more that they want their individually executed bite at the apple, so to speak. We could also get into, the side, I was going to use the word racket, so I just did. I'll use the word racket of some other, without naming any of them, non-necessarily affiliated with the institution, services that do scanning of your environment, etc. And by definition, they can't scan your environment. They can't opine on what they're actually trying to opine upon. And large institutions spend more time unwinding that, so to speak, and explaining things like, okay, you queried 2 laptops on our guest network that we're not trying to control and characterize that as our endpoint environment. Not helpful. So my point is because there's such a thirst to do this, it spawns some side activities which are not productive and doesn't help anyone in terms of efficiently spent time.
So just to add on to what Tom said, right, from a service provider perspective, right, I really wish everybody really takes time to read the SOC reports provided and then tailor the questions, or is there is easier tool that says already covered in the SOC report and then provide only things that is not covered, right? If there is something that would be really good. Back to you.
Okay. I'm gonna shift gears a little bit because we've been talking about technology, we've been talking about tools, and we've been talking about process. I'd like to talk about one of Checco's favorite comments or concepts, people-centric protection. And will we ever reach the same maturity and fidelity in people-centric protection that we have achieved with technology protection?
Yeah, so having been involved in cybersecurity since the late '80s, we've really done a great job addressing every single technology vulnerability out there. Right? Anytime a new vulnerability or a weakness comes out there, or even an exploit comes out, the vendors are really quick to find a patch, find a solution. But when it comes to social engineering and what we call people protection, we're doing the same security awareness training for everybody. We're giving them really no tools to kind of better protect themselves. So and I'll be honest, this is one of the reasons why I did join Proofpoint, is because they had that focus. They have a suite. They have a suite that kind of addresses the high fidelity, looking at a specific person and saying what type of training, what type of protection do we need for you specifically, and I think that's going to be a maturity process that's going to happen over the years. But it's funny to see that we still are spending a lot of our money on technology protection.
So basically, the answer is yes, we might, but it'll take a while.
Yeah, I think for the industry to get there and to realize that they need to have that level of fidelity, as I call it, it'll take a while.
Okay. Anyone else have thoughts on people-centric protection?
Yeah, to me, it's introducing some interesting dynamics and reactions from not only a business leadership perspective, but other corporate functions perspective. When you think about people risk, not only in terms of things like training, which I completely agree with, role-specific training, but also in terms of what we think of as insider analytics. And as that emerges and continues to emerge, we're trying to be very careful from a governance standpoint about what our defined use cases look like. You can do some scary things with insider analytics if you're not disciplined about particularly how you use the outputs. But it's difficult for some people to get their head around the idea of, if we identified by looking at patterns of activity, and certainly bordering on ML, I don't believe it's AI at all, some people might disagree, something that looks untoward. Like it appears that this person may be amassing data, and by the way, they have an end date, they're retiring in 3 months. Internal reactions sometimes even bend toward, oh my God, how could you have let this happen? Couldn't you have detected? No, we're now detecting things more proactively than we could before. That's a good thing. It's not a bad thing, but it's sometimes perceived as the idea things, because these things weren't known before, they shouldn't have been happening. So pulling people's kind of head out of the sand and saying we need to selectively pay attention to these things, and we're not going to be able to specify ahead of time exactly what we're going to find out, which is the whole point. That's a shift in mindset for some people.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples was from a previous employer. I was actually on a security response team, and they were monitoring, this person who was opening up tons of PDFs every single day and getting, their device had to be re-imaged like once a week. And they were saying, well, just how come we're not teaching them? And it turns out they were a recruiter. They had opened up PDFs. That was their job. And we just don't have, again, we need that, that intelligence to understand who's doing what.
Yeah, and also looking at the other side, right? I think the events from this week, with the major breach, we all come to learn that it is the plain basic social engineering that led to the massive breach for Twitter, right? Something like that, right? How can we prevent, right? Is it the basic hygiene of having privileged access management? Do you have one master tool that can do a lot of things, right? It is really it is not just a security problem at that point, but it's really your overall architecture and how you want to support and how you want to control, right? Again, it all comes back to the basics.
Yeah,
And Shan,
I think
thank
if
you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think I agree that the insider programs can get kind of thorny. There's a lot of issues, regulatory, legal, and other things. But if you kind of flip this on its head and think of enabling better authorization decisions rather than a reactive detective kind of function, there's a lot of power in understanding people, their roles, what their norms are, and being able to neck down the authorizations that they require to do their jobs, because everyone's by and large a little bit different. And thinking about people first and their roles in the organization, then help prevent the need for the detective insider capability down the road, because by the very nature they don't have access to the things that they shouldn't have access to.
Yeah, and I would just weigh in on that. There's a lot of technology that's emerging, that software-defined perimeter is one of the good ones that will provide privileged access simply on a case-by-case, context-by-context basis. So, for example, there's nobody sitting around, or very few people sitting around with the keys to the kingdom of your major application. That has to be tied to a specific trouble ticket. So if I have a problem, yes, a support engineer can temporarily get access to come in and help me, but then that access has to be revoked. And that's one of the big things that I see changing is dynamic issuance and revocation of access based not only on the privilege of the individual, but also the context in which that individual is allowed to exert that privilege. So then Johna no longer becomes privileged sysadmin. Johna is privileged to assist Bruce with his one request, that the moment the request is resolved, Johna gives up that privilege again. And those kinds of things I think help a lot. I know one of Tom's favorite issues is this whole issue of insider threat, insider management. But there's also sort of the broader issue of compliance, logging, and auditing, and understanding what's going on in the environment. How are folks managing security signal and audit trails from SaaS providers? Are you getting the audit information you need to ensure the integrity of your applications and users? Anyone want to take that?
So, I'll take a shot at it. I think that the SaaS landscape is so broad. We see a huge diversity in the quality of the signal and audit trail that SaaS providers emit. You have organizations like Salesforce that allow you to answer all kinds of questions about what's going on with your data, with your people accessing it, even to some extent the state of Salesforce at large. But there are other SaaS providers that provide no visibility at all, right? There's no audit trail. There's nothing, because even when you think about the start of an incident, and you say, what does this user have access to, and what have they done in the last 24 hours? I'd like to be able to query a central point where I've collected all my data to be able to start to answer some basic behavioral questions. And when you think about the universe of SaaS providers you have, there's all kinds of providers. You're like, I have no idea when they last logged in, what they did Did they log in? I mean, these are all just absolute blanks. And I think that we're still at the point where there aren't good patterns for SaaS providers to follow. You know, you can point to Salesforce as an example, but, you know, as you're acquiring services, you want to be able to tell a vendor like, hey, I'd like to buy you, but I wish you did the following things. And we can point at like other areas like privacy and GDPR, like here's a template of what you need to do, and here's other frameworks that you can comply with. But when it comes to audit data and admitting an audit trail that allows you to monitor what's happening, there isn't a good pattern for them to follow. And that's where I think you know, entities like those here around the table and on this call today could kind of band together and say, what does good look like for a SaaS audit trail? Like, what would be useful to me to ingest into my security infrastructure to answer the basic questions of like, is everything going okay? And if it's not, how do I investigate, you know, with the data that I have in front of me?
So John, I'd ask or kind of add a comment there. I'm on the other side. I also work with engineering and development. One of the things that, you know, I didn't have an appreciation for, you know, when you look at the cloud development platforms from Google to Amazon to Microsoft to all these different platforms, they're not equal, right? And this particular aspect is one of those diversity points. Some platforms allow you to get, you know, very detailed information, you know, in some cases down to the hypervisor. Some just simply don't have the facilities or the APIs to do it. So from a consumer standpoint of those types of SaaS services, you know, if the compliance to logging and auditing is there, that is a definite checkbox that has to be looked at. And what type of data are you looking for? Are you looking for the machine, you know, syslog, which is all your processes and, you know, things making changes? Or are you looking for the human aspect where you've got the people had made a change either by API or, you know, an interactive type session in this case? And there are a widespread, you know, variety. And that's why I'm always skeptical of the ones that go at their own, you know, infrastructure as a platform versus, you know, some of the more common ones, because that level of infrastructure development is not easy and it takes time. So if they kind of go it alone and you're trying to get that data and incorporate it within your SIM and develop automations and process and do the risk probably and put this whole program together, you got to make sure you start with a system that can provide that. As simple as it may sound, right?
And to dovetail off of Victor, it's not only just the same. It's basically when you get back to zero trust, the control plane itself needs to have orchestration amongst all these sensors, which means all this data needs to be harmonized. And if you're not getting it now, it's going to have to be done somewhere. Otherwise, you're not going to get your contextual-based security.
Right. For us, it's about a repeatable process, right? This is the kind of way we think about it. You know, when you sit down with a network administrator or somebody who's doing any type of task or a security operations, you know, say, okay, here's a problem. Do you have a process for that? They say, yeah, I got it. You know, I can. Next question, is it repeatable? Yes, it is. If it's repeatable, it's a candidate for automation. So now I've got this little canned, you know, script or process or whatever it takes, right? And the collection of these automations then comes into orchestration. Orchestration then kind of leads to policy management that says, okay, this condition happened. I want you to execute this automation step, right? And that's how we begin to advance, how we get ahead of, you know, it's impossible for somebody to have 5,000 alerts on a SIM system and come in and try and think they're going to resolve all those in one day. I've got to start to work smarter, right? And it's building those automation steps and that repeatable process is that first start. Right? It comes to pulling in as much data as you can, having the best information from multiple different systems that see something, say something model. The logs are critical, right? And I can't stress that enough. All your dirty laundry, every aspect, where you're going, what you're doing, the connection, zero trust, builds on that. We're connecting all that data. Being able to aggregate that data and act on it, right, is a critical component to your program.
Victor, that was actually brilliant. I just want to repeat, you gave us so many good insights packed into, a minute or two. I just want to highlight this notion and add one thing to it. The question is, Do you have a process? Is it repeatable? If you have a process and if it's repeatable, it's a candidate for automation. That's a gem as a takeaway. The only thing I would add is, do you have a process? Is it documented? Is it repeatable? Because whoever's going to automate it needs to be working from the documentation, not just what's living in somebody's brain. But I think that's
Absolutely.
a great way to pull it together. Yeah.
further comment on it if you want to, even one little step further. For me, the next step is about, and then I'll come back to the people piece here. If I could create a button to run that automation, right, or a trigger or whatever automation it is, and it's a repeatable process, then it does not matter who presses the button, right? Whether it's your most junior intern SecOps guy or your most principal deep guy in wide salary variations, but you get a predictable business outcome. That's what you're after. This event occurred, take this action, block it, don't block it, log it, alert me, whatever programmatic action you want it to take, right? It has to be a repeatable process in that case. But that intelligence piece comes from a large part the logging and understanding what's going in your system. And when you got something working at 10 gig wire speed, like a carrier or something, I mean, there's no way a human can keep up with that, right? This is where the machine learning, the artificial intelligence, and the power of the cloud, this unlimited CPU RAM, we need to embrace it. We need to, stop shunning this concept that I can do everything in-house, right? And start to understand where is the right place to use the cloud, right? But do it responsibly with the security program and everything in place.
And I just want to highlight that notion there too, because I've managed many teams throughout my career, and I can tell you across the board, the hardest thing to do is to break people out of the mindset of, oh, that's Joe's job or that's Mary's job. No, the job needs to be defined and documented so that it can be anyone's job. As I keep saying, what comes before who, not just in the alphabet. So, what is more important than who if you're trying to automate things? I'm keeping an eye on the time. And what I'd like to do, I'm going to do 2 round robins. The first one is just for folks to say briefly and you can repeat, these can be repeated answers if someone else has said what you've said. First one is what your top priorities are for 2020, the remainder of 2020 and next year, 2021. And Shan, we haven't heard from you for a while, so I'll just call people out by name. But Shan, what are your top priorities for the next 18 months?
So the top priority, I would say, really, making sure that we meet all of the compliance requirements and our privilege management, privileged access, and privilege everything. That would be the top priority for us.
Compliance and PAM. Okay.
Yep.
Checco, what about you?
So our priorities for 2020 and 2021 is actually pushing out that people-centric security framework and giving people a way to measure that as a people-centric security maturity framework. So hopefully to see that out soon.
Okay, great. Tom, what about you? What are your top priorities for the next 18 months?
Well, you mentioned that we have a heavy focus on the insider analytics front. That's going to continue. Another thing that I'd add is what I'd call some structured evolution, and you could call it even modernization of some of our identity and access management architecture, and especially if you look at bridging legacy internal resources with external cloud and SaaS resources and realizing at the end of the day, what's the difference? It's a little bit like the zero trust question, but having fewer points of complication and more common services bus for developers and service delivery stakeholders to be able to do their identity and authorization without having to do it the old way just because, that's a particular area of focus and investment for us in the next year or so.
Okay. Bruce, what about you?
Probably two things are primarily one, continued integration of security into our DevOps process. We're a Kubernetes shop, which is a grand experiment that continues on every day with new technologies and new ideas, and really excited SREs trying to do all kinds of things. So making sure that we're well integrated into that and we can introspect on our Kubernetes environment appropriately. And get the results that we want out of that, I think is one big priority. The other is really around secure remote collaboration, recognizing that I have a remote workforce for probably the next 12 to 18 months and at least maybe for the next decade, dramatically changed ratios between who's remote and who's in person. They've gotten through by sheer will to this point, but it is going to become harder and harder for new employees and people to collaborate and join teams in both technical and non-technical roles. So we're spending a lot of time understanding what can we do that will assist them and how do we do that in a way that's in line with their business's risk posture.
Great. And Victor?
I got two. On a personal note, I want to kind of continue to invest in my knowledge in security, and on a personal level, I'm looking for the HCISPP, which is healthcare, right? Information security, privacy, and we're doing a lot more, and especially with the COVID-19. Right, we're engaged, we're talking, we're doing things to help, those, and there's a different language there, and I'm trying to get my hands around, traditional, financial or retail or, enterprise, manufacturing now to healthcare, and make that shift and be a better partner with them to help them understand our technology and where things are going. And on a professional level, we leaning hard into zero trust, SASE, containerization, anything to do with that next generation enterprise architecture, because this thing is evolving. Anybody who's not, paying attention to that needs to kind of wake up and understand that things are changing so fast, and it takes time to keep current.
Okay, and I'm going to do one more round robin, but I just want to read out for the audience what our list is. That's what I've been scribbling over here. Compliance, privileged access management, people-centric security maturity model, insider analytics, identity and access management, security and DevOps, secure remote collaboration, personal cybersecurity development, very important, HCI SPP, and zero trust, escape, SASE, and containerization. So those are some top issues that are resonating with our panel. Last but not least, since I overran time slightly, I'm going to give everybody just 30 seconds, and I will time you, to give the audience one key takeaway, just one key takeaway that they can act on. So it's not something highfalutin like, imagine, envision, it's got to be something practical they can do to take away as they conclude this session. So I'm going to go ahead and let's see. I'm going to kick off with you, Tom. What is one actionable thing that people can do or should do?
To me, the most direct is do that maturity assessment in an external framework and be able to then articulate to business stakeholders what you're doing and why with their money. And that has to be articulated not just in terms of I'm investing in this capability in terms of technical platforms or technical explanation. By and large, they don't care about that and won't understand. What are you doing for them that's going to be able to help them do things faster, smarter, better, and does it match? Now, there are going to be things from a protective standpoint you have to do that the business is not driving, but we can explain business problem solutions that we can provide in technical terms. And if that's rooted back to a maturity assessment, that's a framework they can understand.
So a risk and business-based maturity assessment, great. And remember, you don't get to use anything if someone else gave it. So Shan, what's yours? Your one thing that people should do.
All right. I still want to do what Tom said, but in addition to that, we would invest. In addition to that, we would invest in the training and the proper upskilling for all the folks, right? There are people with so many technologies and new tools and everything being thrown at it. Some people they're able to grab something and swim. Some people are not able to swim. I think we have a lot of institutional knowledge that is with the people, and we should really train everybody so everybody comes to the same leveling plane.
Great. So that's training and upskilling. Bruce, what about you?
Do regular cybersecurity tabletops. We do them quarterly internally. We simulate a bad thing happening, both with our technical and non-technical staff, and we learn from that. And in fact, we had done one around national civil unrest about a year ago that prepped us unknowingly for what happened with COVID and having to do remote office operations. So we were actually quite ready. If you're interested, we actually turned it into a role-playing game like D&D. It's available if you go to Expel's website. The game's called Oh No's, and it's actually a whole playbook on how to run regular and actually enjoyable tabletop simulations.
That's a great one. Regular CyberSec tabletop simulations, absolutely a great idea. Checco.
So, me personally, I think everyone should actually go back and start defining today, if they haven't already, what zero trust means for their corporation, for their enterprise, and start working with their partners, because they have to have all the same definition if it's going to work.
Define zero trust for you. Great one. And last but not least, Victor, 30 seconds, takeaway.
Don't I get his extra 20? No.
No.
One line. I think if there's one actionable thing you could do, I think every organization needs to take a step back and look to see how their DNS is integrated in their cybersecurity architecture. There's so many other things that we could talk about this, but this is the one piece. You know, if you're using Microsoft, for example, and it's not a knock or anything, it's a basic, it's freeware. Everybody's got it somewhere within their organization, but you're not collecting anything that adds value to the company. You're providing a service, but that's all it does. Right, and you need to look at DNS deeper. I need the logs. I need part of that. I need action. I need intelligence that's coming from it. So take a step back.
Yeah, go ahead. What is the actionable thing other than take a step back? What's
take
the
a
thing?
step back and look at DNS into your cybersecurity architecture. I was trying to respect your time. So.
I know. I just needed to be boiled down. Include DNS in your cybersec architecture. Okay,
there you go.
Folks. I'm gonna go ahead and wrap everything up once again. So we have a final set of takeaways. Number one, from Tom, conduct a risk and business-based maturity assessment of cybersecurity. Number two, invest in training and upskilling. I believe that was Shan. From Bruce, regular cybersec tabletop exercises. From Checco, define zero trust and what it means to you. And from Victor, don't forget about DNS and internet infrastructure in your cybersecurity architecture. And that concludes the panel session, and that also concludes today's summit. Thank you all very much for attending. If you asked any questions that haven't been answered, we will get back to you via email if you gave us your contact info. Thank you.